The wind had a name out here on the Llano Estacado. It was a patient thief that stole moisture from the air, color from the sky, and the words from a person's mouth before they were fully formed. Eliza Hart felt it scouring her face, a fine grit coating her tongue. For 2 days, the stagecoach, little more than a wooden box on weary wheels, had crawled across a landscape so vast and empty it felt like the floor of a forgotten ocean. The sun was finally bleeding out across the horizon, staining the dust-choked heavens a bruised and tender purple. "That there's Adobe Wells," old Ike rasped, pointing with a leathered thumb. "Does not get much bigger, and it does not get much better." Eliza leaned out, her bonnet slipping back. The town was a handful of buildings huddled together against the immensity of the plains. A long, low cattle baron's house, a supply post with a sagging porch, a stark wooden church whose steeple seemed to poke accusingly at the sky, and a small office with a faded star painted on its door. It was a place built of necessity, not hope. Clutched in her hand was a letter, its creases softened with sweat and handling. It promised a position, teaching the children of the territory. It promised a small stipend and a room of her own. More than that, it was her ticket here, to the one place she knew she could find Jess and Millie, her cousins, little more than children themselves, orphaned and sent west a year ago to work on the Riker ranch. The letter was her excuse, her shield. The children were her purpose. The coach groaned to a stop in front of the boarding house, the only 2-story structure in town. As Eliza stepped down, her legs unsteady, the world seemed to tilt. The smells of dust, horse, and cooking fires mingled in the cooling air. A man stood on the porch, leaning against a post. He was Comanche, his black hair in 2 long braids, his face a study in plains and stillness. He wore simple denim trousers and a faded calico shirt, but he stood with a rootedness that made the wooden building behind him seem temporary. His eyes, dark and unreadable, met hers for a moment. There was no curiosity in them, no welcome, no hostility. There was only a calm, quiet seeing, as if he were measuring the depth of a river by looking at its surface. Then he looked away, toward the darkening plains, and the moment was gone. Inside, the proprietor, a woman named Mrs. Dawkins, with flour on her apron and weariness in her eyes, showed Eliza to a small, clean room. "The Reverend said you'd be coming," she said, her voice flat. "The school is not built yet. Just talk." "For now." Eliza's heart sank. "The letter." "Oh, the letter's real enough. But talk is cheap. Water is not, Mrs." Dawkins gestured vaguely toward the window. "That's all anyone talks about. Boone Riker is planning to take some men up to Box Willow Creek. Says he's got papers to survey it, divert a channel for his cattle." She shook her head. "That creek is the only year-round water for miles. Folks are on edge." Eliza's anxiety for her cousins sharpened. "I need to see them. Jess and Millie. They work for Mr. Riker." "Mrs." Dawkins's expression softened with a flicker of pity. "He keeps a tight rein on his hands. Miss, especially the young ones." Later, in the common room, nursing a cup of weak tea, Eliza felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes. She was new, an unknown quantity. The Comanche man from the porch was there, sitting alone at a corner table, mending a piece of leather tack. He worked with an economy of motion, his hands sure and steady. He did not seem to notice the low murmurs that followed him when a cowhand entered, nor the way the other patrons gave his table a wide berth. The door swung open again, letting in a gust of wind and 2 men. The first was large, his presence filling the room. He had a thick neck, a sun-reddened face, and the confident swagger of a man who owned everything he looked at. This had to be Boone Riker. The man beside him was thin and pale, dressed in black. His collar was clerical, his face pinched with a kind of sour piety. "Pastor Vale, Mrs." Dawkins murmured, a note of apprehension in her voice. The 2 men strode to the center of the room. Riker's eyes swept over the occupants, dismissing them, until they landed on Eliza. A slow, proprietary smile spread across his face. "Well now, Pastor," Riker boomed, his voice like rocks grinding together. "It seems our guest of honor has arrived." Pastor Vale held up a piece of paper. "By the good and legal authority vested in me, and with this binding document, I am here to announce the formal arrangement of matrimony between Mr. Boone Riker and the newly arrived Miss Eliza Hart." A collective gasp went through the room. Eliza shot to her feet, the tea sloshing onto the floor. "What are you talking about? I have signed no such thing. I have never even met this man." "A proxy contract, my dear child," the pastor said, his voice slick. "Arranged by your late aunt's solicitor to see you settled and cared for. A fine Christian man like Mr. Riker offering you a home, a future." "This is a lie," Eliza said, her voice shaking with a rage that burned away her fear. "I have no such arrangement. My aunt would never—" Riker chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "A woman needs a protector out here, especially one with 2 young wards to consider. Your cousins are quite happy on my ranch. It would be a shame to disrupt their security." The threat was unmistakable, a cold hand squeezing her heart. "You cannot do this," she insisted, her voice rising. "This is illegal. This is monstrous." "What is monstrous?" Pastor Vale said, his eyes narrowing. "Is a young woman arriving alone, unchaperoned, and immediately making a fuss. You have incurred a debt for your travel and lodging, which this fine man has already offered to pay. To refuse him now would be ungrateful. It would cast serious doubt upon your character." Humiliation and fury washed over Eliza in a dizzying wave. The eyes of the room were on her, judging, condemning. She was trapped. A piece of paper she had never seen was being used to steal her life. She looked from Riker's smug face to Vale's cold one, and her gaze fell upon the Comanche man in the corner. He had stopped his work. He was watching the scene, his expression unchanged, but his hands were still. He was listening to every word. "Show me the paper," Eliza demanded, her voice now dangerously quiet. Vale held it out with a triumphant flourish. "This is a copy. Of course, the original is filed safely." Before Riker or the pastor could react, a shadow fell over the table. The Comanche man was standing beside them. He moved with a silence that was startling. He did not look at the 2 men. He looked only at Eliza. He held out his hand. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and calm, a stone settling at the bottom of a well. It was not a question, but an offering, an acknowledgement. For a dizzying second, the world narrowed to the space between them. She saw the quiet strength in his face, the unwavering steadiness in his eyes. He was not challenging Riker. He was recognizing her. Without thinking, she took the paper from Vale's slack fingers and placed it in the man's outstretched hand. He folded it once, neatly, and then, with a single, deliberate motion, tore it in 2, then 4. He let the pieces flutter from his fingers onto the dusty floorboards. Riker's face contorted with fury. "You have no place in this. Tahan, this is white folks' business." The man, Tahan, finally turned his gaze to Riker. The stillness in his eyes was not passive. It was watchful, ancient, and utterly unimpressed. The lady said no, he said, his voice even, "That is everyone's business." For a tense moment, violence hung in the air, thick and heavy as smoke. Riker took a half-step forward, his hand hovering near the pistol on his hip. Tahan did not move, did not tense, he simply stood, a calm impediment to Riker's will. The spell was broken by the quiet click of the door opening. A woman stood there, wearing a man's duster over a simple skirt. A silver star was pinned to her collar. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her face, lined by the sun and by care, held a no-nonsense authority. "Boone," she said, her voice carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "Pastor, is there a problem here that requires my attention?" Riker slowly relaxed. "No problem. Sheriff Ruiz, just a small misunderstanding." He shot Eliza a look of pure venom. "This is not over. I will teach you some manners. Girl, and you," he snarled at Tahan, "will learn to stay out of what does not concern you." He and the pastor turned and stalked out of the boarding house, leaving a wake of stunned silence. Sheriff Alma Ruiz's eyes took in the scene, the torn paper on the floor, Eliza's pale, defiant face, Tahan's quiet watchfulness. She looked at the townsfolk, who were now trying to pretend they had not been listening. "Go on about your business," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Then her gaze rested on Eliza. "I suggest you be very careful. Miss, in this town, you follow the law. You do not let the mob decide your fate." After the sheriff left, the room slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the air was still charged. Eliza stood trembling, the adrenaline draining away, leaving a cold, hard resolve in its place. Her letter was worthless. Her name was now yoked to a scandal. But Jess and Millie were still out there, on that man's ranch, hostages to his ambition. She would not run. She could not. She looked over at Tahan, who had returned to his table and picked up his leatherwork as if nothing had happened. He did not look up, but she knew he was aware of her gaze. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his fingers continuing their steady, rhythmic work. Eliza took a deep breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. She would stay. She would find work, any work, and she would get her cousins back. She had come to Adobe Wells looking for a schoolhouse, but she had found a fight, and looking at the torn pieces of paper on the floor, she knew, with a certainty that was as frightening as it was freeing, that she would not be the one to back down. The day settled into a rhythm of labor. Eliza traded her teacher's slate for a scrub brush and an apron. She rose before the sun to heat water and knead dough, her hands, once soft from books, growing calloused from the harsh lye soap. Mrs. Dawkins, caught between Riker's power and her own precarious living, had given Eliza the work as a form of shelter. It was an unspoken truce. During the day, Eliza was a fixture in the boarding house, quiet and efficient, her presence a constant, low thrum of defiance that Riker and his men felt every time they entered. At night, the real work began. In the warm, cramped kitchen, by the light of a single flickering lamp, she held her school. Her pupils were the children of freighters, a blacksmith's son, 2 girls from a Mexican family who washed laundry for the town. They gathered around the big wooden table, their faces earnest in the dim light. She taught them their letters using a charred stick on a piece of smoothed pine, their numbers by counting dried beans. It was not the school she had been promised, but it was a school nonetheless. It was a small pocket of hope carved out of the encroaching darkness. Sometimes, Tahan was there. He would sit in the shadows of the common room when native families came in from the plains to trade. They brought bundles of dried herbs, yarrow for fevers, sage for cleansing, and yucca root for soap. In return, they sought salt, flour, and sometimes a piece of steel from the blacksmith. Tahan spoke their language and the settler's tongue, his voice a low bridge between 2 worlds. He never translated word for word. He translated meaning, his calm eyes watching the speaker and the listener, ensuring respect flowed both ways. Eliza would watch him, marveling at the patient dignity he possessed, a stillness that seemed to draw all the frantic energy of the town and quiet it. The pressure from Boone Riker was a constant, like the wind. He came into the boarding house one afternoon, not with bluster, but with a cold, smiling confidence. He unrolled a document on the front counter for Mrs. Dawkins to see. It was covered in legal script and bore a fancy seal. He spoke of his undisputed right to the water at Box Willow Creek, how his improvements would bring prosperity to the whole territory. He then mentioned how difficult it was for a lone woman to get her supply wagons through without friends in high places. The threat was as clear as the water he intended to steal. Mrs. Dawkins grew paler, her hands twisting in her apron, but she said nothing. Riker's man, Deputy Kincaid, took a more direct approach. He was a thick, brutish man who wore his badge as an excuse for cruelty. He found reasons to harass Tahan whenever he was in town. He would knock over a saddle Tahan was mending, claiming it was obstructing a walkway. He would question him loudly about his business, demanding to know where he had been and where he was going, his voice full of insinuation. Each time, Tahan would meet the provocation with an unshakable calm. He would right the saddle without a word. He would answer the questions with simple, direct truths, his gaze steady. He gave Kincaid's anger nothing to hold on to, and the deputy's frustration only grew, festering like a wound. Eliza knew she could not wait for the law or for Providence. She had to get to Jess and Millie herself. One evening, as the sun began to set, she slipped out the back of the boarding house, a small bundle of bread and dried meat under her arm. The Riker Ranch was 2 miles out of town, a sprawling domain of corrals and barns, all lorded over by the main house. She kept off the main road, walking in the long shadows cast by the low hills, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She found the bunkhouse where the younger hands were kept. Jess saw her first, his eyes widening in disbelief. He was taller than she remembered, but his face was thinner, etched with a new and unfamiliar caution. Millie was inside, mending a shirt. When she saw Eliza, she burst into tears and threw her arms around her waist, burying her face in Eliza's skirt. Eliza held them close, whispering assurances. She told them her plan, that she would find a way for them to leave, that they would be a family again, but fear was a taut leash around them. Jess told her Mr. Riker knew everything that happened on his land. He said they were fed and had a roof, and that was more than many had. He spoke of Riker's temper, of the harsh punishments for small mistakes, looking for a place where they could speak without being overheard. Eliza led them away from the bunkhouse, toward a dark, quiet storage barn. The main door was locked, but a smaller side door was ajar. It led into a room Riker used as an office. A large desk stood against one wall, and on it, held down by a rock, was a large, hand-drawn map. Lines had been etched onto it in black ink, showing a new channel, a diversion that would bleed Box Willow Creek dry long before it reached the communal grazing lands. On a shelf behind the desk were several thick leather-bound ledgers. Eliza opened one. It was a record of debts. Page after page listed the names of settlers in and around Adobe Wells. Mrs. Dawkins was in there, for supplies advanced on credit. Old Ike, for the feed for his horses. Even the blacksmith. Riker did not just own the land. He owned the people on it, binding them to him with chains of obligation. This was not a ranch. It was a kingdom built on fear and scarcity. A noise outside sent a jolt of panic through her. She pushed the children toward the back window, telling them to go, to say nothing. She would find a way. As they scrambled out into the darkness, the wind began to moan, a low, mournful sound that was rising quickly in pitch. The sky to the west was no longer purple, but a sickly yellow-brown. A wall of dust was rolling toward them across the plains. The sandstorm hit with the force of a physical blow. The world dissolved into a howling, blinding chaos of grit and wind. Eliza pressed herself against the barn wall, pulling her shawl over her head, unable to see, barely able to breathe. The air was thick with flying dirt that stung her eyes and scoured her skin. This was nature's fury, immense and indifferent, a power that dwarfed the petty tyrannies of men like Boone Riker. Through the roar of the wind, she thought she heard her name being called. She dismissed it as a trick of the storm. Then a hand gripped her arm, firm and steady. She cried out, spinning around to see a figure silhouetted against the swirling dust. It was Tahan. His braids were whipped back by the wind, his face a mask of concentration. He did not shout over the storm. He leaned close, his voice calm and clear in her ear. He said, "You must come now. Both of you." He pointed, and she saw 2 small shapes huddled near the corral. Jess and Millie. He had found them. He led them away from the ranch buildings, Not toward the road, but in the opposite direction, toward a deep, shadowy cut in the earth she had not noticed before. It was a dry creek bed, an arroyo. Tahan guided them down the crumbling bank, down in the belly of the wash. The wind was less ferocious. They could still hear it screaming above them, a ravenous beast. But here they were sheltered. Tahan moved with a sure-footed certainty, his hand never leaving Millie's shoulder, his eyes scanning the path ahead. They hurried through the winding channel, the sand heavy under their feet. Eliza's breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs aching from the dust. In her haste, her foot came down hard on something sharp, hidden beneath the sand. A sudden, piercing pain shot up from her heel. She gasped, stumbling, but caught herself on the sandy wall of the arroyo. She did not stop. She could not. She pushed the pain down, limping forward, her only thought to keep up, to get the children to safety. After what felt like an eternity, Tahan led them up a gentler slope and out of the creek bed. The storm was passing, the wind beginning to lose its terrifying force. They were in a small, protected cove, sheltered by a ring of ancient cottonwood trees. A few hide-covered structures stood in the twilight, a thin curl of smoke rising from one of them. An old woman stood waiting, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her black eyes holding a deep and ancient wisdom. Tahan spoke to her in the Comanche language, his voice soft. The woman, Grandmother Sumua, nodded and looked at Eliza and the children, not with surprise, but with a serene acceptance, as if she had been expecting them all along. She beckoned them toward the warmth of the fire. Safe for the moment. The terror and tension of the flight began to drain away from Eliza, leaving an aching exhaustion in its place. She leaned against a tree, her body trembling. She looked down at her feet. Her sturdy leather shoe, her one good pair, was scuffed and caked with dust. And there, seeping through the worn leather at the heel, was a small, dark stain. It was the color of drying blood. She stared at it, a single drop of red on the parched brown earth, and knew it was the first price she had paid for their freedom. In the pre-dawn stillness of the Comanche camp, the world was soft and gray. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. Grandmother Sumua knelt before Eliza, her hands moving with a gentle, practiced certainty. She cleansed the wound on Eliza's heel, a deep puncture from a mesquite thorn, with a wash made from boiled yucca root. The pain had kept Eliza awake most of the night, a throbbing reminder of their desperate flight. Now, as Sumua applied a poultice of chewed yarrow leaves, a cool, clean sensation seeped into the wound, quieting the fire. Sumua's words were sparse, her touch her primary language. She showed Eliza the plants, not just their names, but their spirits. "This one," she indicated with a gnarled finger, "is for pain. This one, the silver-leafed sage, is for clearing the air and the mind." She did not teach like a schoolmarm with a pointer. She shared knowledge as one would share bread, a simple, necessary act of sustenance. As her foot began to heal, Eliza found her own way to contribute. The camp was alive with children, their laughter and games a constant current of life. Seeing them, Eliza felt the teacher in her stir, using a piece of charcoal from the fire in the smooth, pale surface of a shoulder bone. She began to draw letters. The children gathered, their curiosity a powerful magnet. She taught them the shape of an A, the curve of a B. In return, they showed her which berries were sweet and which would knot her stomach, how to track a rabbit by its nearly invisible prints, how to sit still and listen to the language of the wind in the cottonwoods. Jess and Millie, their faces slowly losing the pinched, haunted look from the Riker Ranch, became her best students and her most patient instructors, bridging the small gaps of understanding between Eliza and the Comanche children. A few days later, when she could walk without a severe limp, Tahan led her from the sheltered camp. They walked toward the sound of running water. They emerged from the brush onto the banks of Box Willow Creek. It was not a mighty river, but in this parched land, it was a miracle. The water ran clear and cool over smooth stones, its banks lined with a ribbon of impossible green. Cottonwoods and willows grew thick, their leaves whispering in the slight breeze. "This is what he wants to take," Eliza said, her voice soft with awe. Tahan nodded, his gaze on the moving water. "He sees it as water for his cattle. We know it is the life of the land. The old ones say the water that runs from under the earth is the land's own breath. If you stop its breath, the grass dies. The deer and the antelope leave. The people cannot stay. It is not a thing to be owned. It is a thing to be shared." He crouched and dipped his hand into the stream, letting the cool water run through his fingers. "He has a piece of paper. He thinks his paper is stronger than the thirst of the land." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the gurgle of the creek and the rustle of the leaves. In that quiet space, trust began to put down roots. Eliza found herself speaking of her fears, not of Riker's physical threats, but of the shame he and Pastor Vale tried to weaponize against her. The false marriage contract was a stain she felt she could not wash away, a lie that would follow her, branding her as a fallen woman in a world that offered few second chances. Tahan listened, his expression unchanging. When she finished, he looked out across the plains. "A name is what others call you," he said, his voice low. "It is not who you are." Then, for the first time, he spoke of his own past. He told her of his time as a scout for the Army cavalry. He had believed it was a way to protect his people, to understand the white man's way of war, and perhaps find a path to peace. He guided them through lands he knew. His skills used to hunt men instead of game. The memory that haunted him most was not of a great battle, but of a small skirmish, a misunderstanding that erupted into gunfire. He had fired a warning shot, aiming high, but a young soldier, barely a boy, had stumbled into its path. The bullet had torn through the boy's shoulder. Tahan saw the look of shock and pain on his face before the boy fell. He had not killed him, but he had marked him, had taken part in the very violence he had hoped to prevent. He left the army the next day, the guilt a heavy stone in his gut, a burden he still carried. His confession was a quiet offering, a sharing of scars. It made Eliza's own fears of gossip and reputation seem small, and yet he treated her burden with the same solemn respect he gave his own. They were two people marked by a world that sought to define them by its own harsh rules. A week after their escape, a familiar wagon rumbled into a clearing near the camp. It was old Ike. He had come with a message from Mrs. Dawkins. He also brought a small crate of supplies she had sent: flour, salt, and coffee. Tucked inside a sack of beans was a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. It was a package addressed to Eliza in her mother's elegant script, having arrived at the stage office months ago and held by Mrs. Dawkins for safekeeping. Eliza's hands trembled as she unwrapped it. Inside was her mother's journal. That night, by the low fire, she opened the book. The pages were filled with her mother's thoughts, recipes and sketches of wildflowers. It was a voice from the past, a comfort so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Tucked into a pocket at the back of the journal was a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of a letter, painstakingly transcribed in her mother's hand. It detailed a land transaction from years ago, for a small plot of land her family had once owned back east before falling on hard times. The letter described the sale in clear, simple terms, and at the bottom, listed as the intermediary who had brokered the deal and taken a handsome fee, was a name that made the air freeze in Eliza's lungs: Pastor Vale. He had a history of manipulating paper for profit. It was not proof against Riker, not yet, but it was a seed of a different kind of truth. It was a key. She sat for a long time, the journal open in her lap, the firelight dancing on the pages. She felt a shift inside her, the fear receding, replaced by a cold, clear anger. They had underestimated her. They saw a lone woman, a schoolteacher, a victim. They did not see her mother's daughter. As if sensing the change in her, Grandmother Sumua came and sat beside her. She did not speak, but followed Eliza's gaze to the fire. After a moment, the old woman rose and returned with a blanket. She unfolded it and draped it around Eliza's shoulders. It was a simple wool blanket, but beautifully made. One half was woven in a pattern of straight, clean lines, like rain falling on the earth. The other half was a pattern of interlocking diamonds, representing the strength of family and community. The two designs met in the middle, distinct yet harmonious. "This is to warm your courage," Sumua said, her voice a soft whisper. Eliza pulled the blanket tighter around her. The wool was warm, smelling faintly of sage and smoke. It felt like an embrace, an anointing. The creek was the breath of the land. The journal was a weapon from the past, and this blanket, a gift from a new kind of family, was a shield for the fight to come. The night on the plains had 1,000 voices. The wind whispered through the dry grass. The coyotes yipped in the distant darkness, and the cottonwood leaves rustled like secrets being passed from one to another. In the quiet of the Comanche camp, these sounds were a kind of peace. Eliza sat wrapped in the blanket Sumua had given her, the two patterns a weight of comfort on her shoulders. Jess and Millie were asleep nearby, their breathing deep and even, finally untroubled, across the low fire. Tahan worked a piece of wood with a small knife, his hands moving with a fluid grace, shaving away curls of pine that glowed for an instant before turning to ash. The piece was broken not by a sound, but by a light, a hungry, flickering orange that danced where it should not be, painting the underside of the cottonwood leaves in a hellish glow. It grew with an unnatural speed, accompanied by a crackling that was sharper than the gentle pop of their campfire. Tahan was on his feet in an instant, the carving and knife forgotten. A man shouted in the darkness, a cry of alarm. The camp stirred, figures emerging from lodges, their faces stark with confusion and fear in the pulsing, malevolent light. A small shed at the edge of the camp, where tools, cured hides, and winter supplies were stored, was engulfed in flames. The fire clawed at the night sky, a roaring beast consuming everything within its reach. Men ran with water skins and blankets, their efforts seeming pitifully small against the inferno. The heat was a physical force, pushing them back. Eliza gathered the terrified children, pulling them away from the heat and the chaos, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was no accident. This was a message. They fought the blaze until it was a smoldering, black ruin, hissing and spitting into the night. The loss was heavy. Tools that were vital for survival, carefully prepared food stores, materials for mending and making, all gone, turned to smoke and ash. As the last of the flames died, a silence fell over the camp, thicker and more menacing than the darkness. It was a young boy who saw it first. He pointed with a trembling finger toward the largest of the cottonwoods that bordered the creek. There, hanging from a low, thick branch, stark against the last of the fire's glow, was a rope, a thick hemp rope, tied into a hangman's noose. It swayed gently in the breeze, a patient, silent promise of violence. It was a wordless accusation and a death sentence, aimed directly at the heart of their small community, aimed directly at Tahan. Sheriff Alma Ruiz arrived the next morning. Her face was a grim mask as she surveyed the charred remains of the shed and the rope, which still hung from the tree. She examined the ground, her keen eyes missing nothing. She found tracks from shod horses, tracks that did not belong to the unshod ponies of the Comanche. She knelt and picked up a small object from the dust, a single, spent brass cartridge, different from the type Tahan used. "It is not enough," she said to Eliza, her voice low and frustrated. "It is evidence of a crime. Yes, but it does not have Boone Riker's name on it. In town, Pastor Vale is preaching sermons about the sanctity of property and the dangers of vagrants and heathens. He is stirring up the good people, making them afraid. He has sent petitions to the county judge, demanding Riker's water claim be recognized for the good of the community. He is building a wall of words, and I am trying to tear it down with facts. It is slow work." She looked from Eliza to Tahan. "Be careful. The law is coming, but it is walking on a broken leg." The sheriff's warning settled like a stone in Eliza's stomach. That night, she could not sleep. She lay on her blankets, listening to the breathing of the children beside her, and felt a cold tide of fear wash over her. She had brought this danger upon them. Her defiance had led to this fire, this rope. The thought of running, of taking the children and disappearing into the vastness of the territory, was a desperate, seductive whisper. They could go to a new town, find a new life, leave this ugliness behind. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. Tahan found her by the creek, staring into the dark, moving water. He did not ask what troubled her. He seemed to already know. He stood beside her, a quiet, solid presence in the darkness. "You are thinking of leaving," he said. It was not an accusation. "Should I not?" she whispered, her voice tight with unshed tears. "Look what has happened. The children. I cannot let them be hurt because of me." "Riker's anger is not your fault," he said. "He is a man who takes what he wants. If not this, it would be something else." He paused, then looked up at the star-dusted sky. "When I was with the soldiers, I wanted to stop the killing. I thought I could use their ways against them. In a fight, a young man, a boy, ran out from behind a wagon. My captain shouted to fire. I aimed my rifle to the sky, but the boy tripped and fell just as I shot." He stopped, and the memory seemed to fill the space between them. A tangible, heavy thing. The bullet hit his shoulder. I can still see his face. The surprise. He did not even know he was in a war. I carried him to their doctor. I never knew if he lived or died. But I know that a piece of my bullet is a part of his body. I put it there." He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep and settled pain. "I left that life. I will not fire a gun at another man again, but that does not mean I will run. Running does not heal the wound. It only leaves it behind for someone else to find." His story settled her frantic thoughts. He was not telling her to stay. He was showing her who he was, sharing the weight of the scar on his soul. It was a trust more profound than any she had ever known. In the flickering starlight, she saw that his rain slicker, draped over a nearby rock, had a long tear in the shoulder. Without a word, she went and got her sewing kit. She sat on the bank of the creek and, by the faint light, began to stitch the tear with neat, strong sutures, as if mending a wound. He watched her, his silence a form of communication. When she finished, she handed it back to him. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting touch that sent a current of warmth through her. They started back toward the camp, walking side by side. They came to a place where the creek cut deep, and the crossing was a series of slick, unsteady stones. He stepped across first, then turned and held out his hand. She took it. His grip was firm, calloused, and steady. He guided her across the treacherous stones, his hand a solid anchor in the uncertain darkness. He did not let go until they were both safely on the other side. The gesture was small, practical, necessary, but in that moment, holding his hand, Eliza knew she was no longer alone in her fear. She was not a woman fighting for her cousins. She was a partner in a struggle for the life of this place. The thought of running was gone, burned away like the shed, leaving behind only the hard, clear certainty of what she had to do. They would not run. They would stand. They would fight, not with fire and rope, but with a courage that was quieter and far, far stronger. The law in Adobe Wells was a small, dusty wooden shed that smelled of aging paper and the slow decay of ink. It stood behind the sheriff's office, a flimsy testament to the territory's belief in written rules. The lock on the door was a simple iron one, meant to discourage casual curiosity, not a determined entry. In the deep, moonless dark, Sheriff Alma Ruiz worked on it with a thin piece of metal, her movements precise and economical. Eliza stood beside her, holding a lantern with a shuttered front, casting a single, nervous beam of light 100 yards away, hidden in the deep shadows of the livery stable. Tahan watched the street, a silent, motionless guardian. "This is a risk," "Eliza," Alma whispered. "Not for the first time." The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. "If we are caught, my badge will not save us. It will be the thing they use to hang me." "And if we do nothing?" Eliza whispered back. "Boone Riker will own the water, and everyone in this valley will be his subjects, not his neighbors. We have to know how he is doing it." They slipped inside, closing the door behind them. The air was thick and still. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with ledgers, rolled maps, and dusty cardboard boxes tied with string. It was the entire recorded history of the county, a jumble of land claims, birth certificates, and tax records. Alma moved with a purpose, her beam of light falling on a locked wooden chest in the corner. "This is where the official county seals are kept. All major documents have to be embossed." She pried the lid open. Inside, nestled on a bed of worn velvet, lay a heavy brass seal on a wooden handle, the official seal of the Llano Estacado County. But beside it, wrapped in an oilcloth, was a second seal. It was nearly identical, but the brass was newer, the edges of the lettering infinitesimally sharper. "2 of them," Eliza breathed, running her finger over the cold metal of the newer one. "Why would there be 2? Alma's face was grim in the lantern light. There would not be, unless one was a forgery. She opened a thick logbook that lay beside the chest. "This records every time a seal is used. The document, the date, the signature of the officer who applies it." She ran her finger down the page. Entry after entry for the past year was signed by the same person, Deputy Kincaid. He is in charge of this room. He controls access. He is the one who locks this chest every night. The pieces fell into place with a sickening thud. Kincaid was not just Riker's muscle. He was his forger, his key to making illegal claims look like the law of the land. He had been creating false documents, using a counterfeit seal to give them the weight of authority. Riker did not need to break the law when he had a man on the inside who could rewrite it for him. "We need the original survey maps," Eliza said, her mind racing. "The ones that show the water rights before Riker ever came here." They began a frantic, whispered search. They pulled down heavy rolls of parchment, their hopes sinking with each one that showed a railroad survey or a town plat. They were about to give up when Eliza noticed a long, thin canvas tube tucked away in a dark corner, labeled simply Old Boundary Disputes. It felt different from the others, the canvas older, the leather tie more brittle. She carefully unrolled it on the floor. It was a map, drawn not with modern ink, but with the brownish-black lines of old iron gall ink. It depicted Box Willow Creek and the surrounding lands. It was dated 1858. It clearly showed the creek and an area of several square miles around it designated as communal grazing, non-exclusive use. A grant made to the original settlers and the native tribes who used the valley. The map predated every one of Riker's claims. It was the foundational document, the true law of the land. And there, near the signature of the territorial surveyor, was a small, dark, reddish-brown fleck. It was a stain that had soaked into the very fibers of the parchment, a silent, indelible testament to some long-forgotten conflict. It was the color of old, dried blood. A low whistle, the perfect imitation of a nighthawk, sounded from outside. Tahan's signal. Trouble. Alma rolled the map quickly, her movements urgent. "We have to go, now!" They slipped out of the shed, their hearts pounding. The street was empty, a river of pale dust in the starlight. They were halfway to the sheriff's office when a figure stepped out from the alley beside the blacksmith's shop, blocking their path. It was Deputy Kincaid, a lantern in one hand, a pistol in the other. "Evening, Sheriff," he said, his voice a low, menacing drawl. "Miss Hart, taking a late-night stroll. Are we looking for something you lost?" His eyes flickered to the map tube in Alma's hand. A cold smile touched his lips. He knew. "That is official county property. Kincaid," Alma said, her voice steady, though Eliza could feel the tension radiating from her. "And you are interfering with a sheriff in the course of her duties?" "I do not see a sheriff." Kincaid sneered. "I see a thief and a troublemaker. Riker wants you gone. I think it is time you listened." He raised the pistol. Tahan melted out of the shadows behind Kincaid, his rifle held at a low ready. He was 50 feet away. A clear shot, a silent wraith against the dark wood of the livery. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Eliza saw the muscles in Tahan's jaw clench, saw his entire body tense, ready to act. She saw the ghost of the Boy Scout in his eyes, the memory of the bullet he could not take back. Kincaid was not aiming to kill. He was aiming to terrify. He swung the pistol slightly to the side and fired. The shot was a deafening crack that ripped the night apart. The bullet screamed past Eliza's head, and she felt a sudden, searing line of fire along her left forearm. It felt as if a hot iron had been laid against her skin. She cried out, stumbling back, clutching her arm. Alma drew her own weapon, but Kincaid was already backing into the alley. That was a warning. He snarled, "Next one will not miss," and then he was gone. Tahan was at their side in an instant, his face a mask of controlled fury, his eyes searching Eliza for injury. "It is just a graze," she said, her voice shaking, though she tried to keep it steady. Blood was welling up, a dark and shocking sight against her pale skin, soaking the sleeve of her dress. Her training as a part-time midwife, her practical knowledge of the body, took over. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. While Alma kept watch, her pistol trained on the empty alley, Eliza tore a long strip from her petticoat with her teeth and her good hand. She folded it into a thick pad and pressed it hard against the wound, then wrapped another strip tightly around her arm, knotting it securely. Her movements were sure, practiced, a stark contrast to the terror that was still ricocheting through her. She had the proof. They had the map, the key to unraveling Riker's entire scheme, but holding it in her hand, feeling the warm, wet stickiness of her own blood on her fingers. She understood the cost. The dried blood on the map was no longer just a historical curiosity. It was a prophecy. Justice in this land did not come from dusty papers and official seals alone. It had to be bought with courage, and it had to be paid for in blood. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation with Kincaid left no room for deliberation. The threat was no longer a shadow or a rumor. It had a face, a gun, and a willingness to spill blood. Adobe Wells was a cage, and the Comanche camp, once a sanctuary, was now a known target. With the dawn came a hard decision, spoken in the quiet, grim tones of people who had run out of options. The precious map was entrusted to Sheriff Ruiz, who would ride for the county seat to seek a federal marshal. Eliza, Tahan, Jess, and Millie had to disappear. Their destination was the Palo Duro Canyon, a great bleeding wound in the flat plains, a place of immense and wild beauty, so vast and rugged a man could hide an army in its folds and no one would ever know. Tahan knew its secrets, its hidden springs and defensible ledges. It was their only hope for a safe haven while the law, slow and uncertain, made its journey. They traveled light and fast, pushing their horses hard through the gray twilight. Eliza's arm was a dull, persistent ache, wrapped tightly in its bandage, a constant reminder of the stakes. She rode one horse, with a terrified but resolute Millie seated in front of her. Jess rode with Tahan, his young face set in a determined mask that could not quite hide his fear. They moved like ghosts across the land, leaving the small flicker of Adobe Wells behind them. By midday, they reached the rim of the canyon. The world simply fell away. The flat prairie gave way to a dizzying abyss of red rock and sculpted stone, a landscape carved by wind and water over millennia. Far below, a river snaked like a silver thread. The scale of it was breathtaking and terrifying. It felt like standing on the edge of the world. The descent was a slow, nerve-wracking business. The trail was little more than a goat path, a narrow scar winding down the steep canyon wall. Loose scree shifted under the horses' hooves, sending small cascades of pebbles rattling into the depths below. Eliza kept one arm securely around Millie's waist, her other hand holding the reins, her knuckles white. She could feel the child trembling. They had navigated the worst of the upper cliffs and were traversing a long, narrow ledge that overlooked a sheer drop of several hundred feet. The path was barely wide enough for a single horse. Tahan led the way, his movements calm and deliberate, his horse picking its way with the cautious certainty of an animal born to this terrain. It happened without warning. A large, flat stone, dislodged by the led horse, shifted under the hooves of Eliza's mount. The horse gave a startled whinny, its back feet slipping on the loose gravel. It scrambled for purchase, muscles bunching in panic, the world tilting at a sickening angle. Eliza was thrown from the saddle, her grip on Millie torn away. Time seemed to slow, to stretch. She had a fleeting image of the vast, empty sky above and the terrifying, beckoning space below. Her fall was not a plummet, but a sideways slide, a desperate scrabble for a handhold that was not there. Then, a force like a steel band clamped around her waist. Tahan, reacting with a speed that defied thought, had spurred his horse alongside hers, leaning far out of his own saddle. Her skirt rode up as he grabbed her Comanche, lifted her gently, pressing her near in breathless rapture. One moment she was falling into nothingness. The next she was held fast against him, pulled from the brink and onto the front of his saddle. Her face was pressed against the hard warmth of his chest. She could hear the frantic, powerful beat of his heart, or perhaps it was her own, a wild drum echoing in the sudden, ringing silence. Her body was awash with a dizzying mix of terror and a profound, bone-deep relief that was so intense it felt like a kind of joy. He held her there for a long moment, his arm a solid, unyielding anchor, his breath warm against her hair. The world came back into focus, the solidness of the horse beneath them, the vast, silent emptiness of the canyon, the warmth of the sun on her back. He carefully maneuvered his horse to a wider spot on the ledge, a small alcove in the rock wall. Only then did he loosen his grip, his hands moving to her shoulders to steady her as he eased her to the ground. Jess and Millie, their faces ashen, watched with wide, silent eyes. Eliza's legs felt like water, and she leaned against the rock wall for support, her body trembling uncontrollably. He dismounted and stood before her, his face unreadable but his eyes dark with a fierce, protective light. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently push a stray strand of hair back from her face, his fingers barely grazing her temple. The gesture was so tender, so full of unspoken care, that it nearly broke her. Later, when they had found a safe place to make a cold camp, a hidden ledge with a small seep of fresh water, the conversation they had been avoiding finally came. The children were asleep, exhausted by fear and the long ride. The near disaster on the cliff edge had stripped away all pretense, leaving them raw and vulnerable. "This is my fault," Tahan said, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. He was staring into the vast, star-filled space of the canyon. The fire, the rope, Kincaid's bullet. "Your fall. I have brought this danger to you. I should have told you to run. From the very first day." Eliza shook her head, pulling the two-patterned blanket tighter around her shoulders. "You did not bring this. Tahan, Boone Riker did. Pastor Vale did. You gave me a choice. Before you, I had none." She paused, the words catching in her throat. "What I am afraid of is not the danger. Not really. I am afraid of what they will call me, what they will make me into. They tried to make me a possession with a piece of paper. Now they will say I am a white woman who ran away with a Comanche. They will use it to strip away my name, my honor, everything, until I am nothing but the story they want to tell about me." He turned to look at her, and in the faint starlight she could see the pain in his eyes. It was a pain that mirrored her own. "And I am afraid," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "that they are right. I am a man between worlds. To them, I am a savage. To some of my own people, I am a man who wore the army's blue coat, To bring you into my world is to put you in that same place. It is a place with no name and no safety. The truth of it hung between them, cold and sharp as the night air. They were on a precipice, far more dangerous than the one she had fallen from. She looked at him, at his strong, quiet face, at the decency and honor that radiated from him like warmth from a fire. She thought of the false contract, the whispers, the judgmental eyes in the boarding house. Then she thought of his hand tearing that paper, his steady presence in the storm, his quiet sharing of his own deepest wound. Then let them talk, she said, her voice finding a new strength. They do not get to write our story, Tahan. We do. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. I am not that woman on their paper, and you are not the ghost from your past. We are who we choose to be. Right here. Right now. He covered her hand with his own. His skin was warm, his grip strong. It was a silent affirmation, a pact made on the edge of the world. Then we choose each other, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he did not try to hide. And we choose the right way. No more running. We see this through, together. It was not a promise of an easy life, but of a shared one. A promise that whatever names the world tried to call them, they would have one of their own, forged in this wild, beautiful, and dangerous place. Together. They returned to Adobe Wells under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. News of Sheriff Ruiz's return with the original map had preceded them, carried on the wind like a spark. The town was a powder keg, waiting. As they rode down the main street, windows shuttered, but they could feel the eyes watching from the cracks, feel the weight of a community holding its breath. The air was unnaturally still, hot and heavy, charged with a tension that was almost electric. Boone Riker and Pastor Vale had not been idle in their absence. They had turned Eliza's flight not into an escape, but a kidnapping. Vale's sermons had been fiery, painting a lurid picture of a savage heathen spiriting away an innocent Christian woman. He spoke of the duty of good men to protect their womenfolk, to cleanse the community of a dangerous influence. Riker, meanwhile, had gathered a posse of his most loyal ranch hands and a handful of townsmen indebted to him, calling them a Citizens' Vigilance Committee. They were not lawmakers. They were an instrument of his will, a mob given a fancy name. Sheriff Ruiz met them in front of her office. She looked tired but resolute. She had not waited for a marshal. She knew this had to be settled here, in the court of public opinion, before it ever reached a judge. She unrolled the old parchment map on a wooden barrel for all to see, its edges weighted down with stones. This is the original survey. Alma's voice rang out, clear and steady, cutting through the tense silence. Dated 1858. It designates Box Willow Creek and the surrounding lands for communal use. It predates any claim made by Mr. Riker. It is the law. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the confrontation. They kept their distance, a loose circle of uncertainty. Riker and Vale pushed their way to the front, flanked by Deputy Kincaid and a half-dozen hard-faced men. A few of them carried new-looking ropes coiled over their shoulders. That is just an old piece of paper, Riker boomed, dismissing the map with a wave of his hand. Worthless. I have a legally sealed and filed deed. A deed sealed with a counterfeit stamp, Alma retorted, her eyes like chips of flint, applied by your man, Kincaid. Kincaid laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. That is a serious accusation. Sheriff, you have no proof. He turned his attention to the crowd, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. He pointed a thick finger not at the map, but at Eliza and Tahan, who stood just behind the sheriff. The only crime here is the one you are looking at. This savage took a decent white woman from our town. Who knows what foulness he forced on her out in the wild. We are here to see justice done. We are here to rescue Miss Hart from her captor. Pastor Vale stepped forward, his hands clasped as if in prayer. Brothers, sisters, we must save this fallen lamb. We must show this brute that the laws of God and man will not be mocked. We must make our community safe again. The words were poison, skillfully administered. The crowd stirred, their uncertainty beginning to curdle into anger. The focus shifted from the legal argument of the map to the visceral, emotional appeal of Vale's narrative. A man shouted, "Let's get him!" Another brandished his rope. The circle began to tighten. This was the moment. The wall of law was crumbling, being washed away by a tide of prejudice and fear. As the first men surged forward, Eliza stepped out from behind the barrel, placing herself directly in their path, directly in front of Tahan. "Stop," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was so clear and sharp with command that the men in front actually hesitated. She stood before them, small and alone, her bandaged arm a stark white against her dusty dress. "He did not capture me," she declared, her eyes sweeping over the faces in the crowd, meeting their hostility with an unwavering gaze. "I went with him by my own choice. I went with him to save my cousins from the man who stands behind you, the man who tried to own me with a fraudulent piece of paper." She turned and pointed directly at Boone Riker. "This man, with the help of Pastor Vale, tried to force me into a marriage I never agreed to. He tried to make me his property. When I refused, he threatened my family. That is the truth. I was not rescued from Tahan. I was rescued by him." She took a deep breath, her voice ringing with a conviction that came from the very core of her being. "You have been told to worry about my honor. Let me tell you, my honor is my own, and it is intact. What you should be worrying about is your water, your land, your future. Boone Riker is using me, using your fear of a good man you do not understand, to distract you while he steals the very lifeblood of this valley. Look at the map. That is the truth. Everything else is just a story made to turn you into thieves on his behalf." A stunned silence fell over the square. Her words had shattered their narrative. They looked from her fierce, defiant face to Riker's suddenly flustered one, to Vale's pinched expression of outrage. The crowd was split. Doubt was a seed planted in the heart of their anger. And then, the sky broke open. The stillness of the day had been a lie. The air, heavy and pregnant, unleashed its burden. A sudden, violent gust of wind tore through the street, kicking up a blinding cloud of dust and sending the precious map skittering away. A low rumble of thunder that had been a distant threat became a deafening, ground-shaking crack. The sky turned from bruised purple to a terrifying, malevolent black. Rain began to fall, not in drops, but in solid sheets, instantly turning the dust to mud. The mob, its single-minded purpose fractured, now dissolved completely into a scattering of individuals seeking shelter from the sudden deluge. But nature's fury was not done. A brilliant, blinding fork of lightning ripped through the black sky, striking with an explosive crack that was followed instantly by a roar of thunder. It did not strike the square. It struck the tall wooden granary on Boone Riker's property at the edge of town. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a wisp of smoke, and then a gout of orange flame erupted from the roof. The dry timber, baked by years of Texas sun, went up like a torch. The fire, fed by the wind, grew with an incredible, terrifying speed. The town's attention, once focused on a man, was now fixed on the monstrous, roaring fire. It was a new enemy, one that threatened them all. Panic set in. People ran, shouting. But through the chaos, Tahan moved. He was not running from the fire. He was running toward it. Near the burning granary was a small shed where the blacksmith, a quiet Navajo man named Charlie Cena, sometimes let his children play. Tahan had seen them there earlier. Charlie saw it at the same moment. The two men's eyes met across the chaotic square, a shared understanding passing between them. Together, they sprinted toward the flames. The shed was not yet on fire, but the heat was immense and thick. Choking smoke was pouring from the granary, enveloping everything. The townspeople stopped, their own fear momentarily forgotten as they watched. They saw the man they had been about to hang, the savage, charge without hesitation into the billowing smoke. They saw Charlie Cena, Another outsider. Follow right behind him. A moment later, Tahan emerged, a small, coughing child in his arms. He passed the child to its mother, who was sobbing with relief, and then turned and plunged back into the smoke. Charlie came out with another, his own son. The fire roared, a monstrous thing against the black, storm-racked sky. It was a force of destruction, a disaster for Riker. But in its terrible, cleansing light, the people of Adobe Wells saw something new. They saw not a heathen to be feared, but a man of courage. They saw not a threat, but a savior. The ugly words of Vale and Riker turned to ash and blew away in the hot, smoky wind. The rope, dropped in the mud by a forgotten hand, was already being trampled under the feet of people who now knew its true purpose was a lie. The fire at the granary raged against the storm, a battle of orange and black, of heat and water. But even as the townsfolk stared, mesmerized by the destruction, a new terror arrived. It came in the form of old Ike, his face a mask of panic, his horses lathered and wild-eyed. He hauled on the reins, skidding his wagon to a stop in the mud-choked street. "It is the creek," he bellowed, his voice raw with fear, barely audible over the roar of the thunder and the flames. "Riker's done it. He took his men up there in the storm. He has cut his channel. The whole creek is backing up behind his dam, and it is not holding." The words cut through the chaos. The burning granary was a loss of property, but a broken dam meant a flood, a wall of water that would sweep through the low-lying parts of town, taking homes, livestock, everything. Riker, under the cover of the storm he had helped to stoke, was making his final, desperate play. He was sacrificing the town itself to claim his prize. A new kind of fear, cold and immediate, replaced the mob's spent anger. Tahan was the first to move. He looked toward the creek. His eyes narrowed, reading the signs of the land even in the tempest. He vaulted onto his pony, his voice cutting through the din. "We have to go now." The town followed him. The mob that had wanted his blood now scrambled to follow his lead. They were no longer Riker's men or Vale's congregation. They were simply people whose homes were in the path of a flood. They ran and rode through the driving rain, a frantic procession slipping and sliding in the mud, their torches extinguished by the downpour, their faces lit only by the intermittent, blinding flashes of lightning. The scene at Box Willow Creek was worse than they had imagined. A deep, raw trench had been gouged from the bank, diverting a significant portion of the flow. To accomplish this, Riker's men had built a crude earthen dam across the main channel. It was little more than a pile of mud, rocks, and felled trees. Now, with the storm turning the creek into a raging, muddy torrent, the dam was failing. Water poured over its top and seeped through a dozen weak points. The entire structure groaned and shuddered under the immense pressure, bulging outward, visibly on the verge of catastrophic collapse. On the far bank, illuminated by a few storm lanterns, stood Boone Riker himself, watching his victory take shape, indifferent to the destruction it would cause. Tahan slid from his horse, his feet sinking into the slick mud. He did not waste time with anger or accusations. He saw only the problem, the immense weight of the water, and the fragile wall of earth holding it back. He began shouting orders, his voice calm but carrying an authority that no one dared to question. "We need sandbags, sacks, anything that will hold dirt. Form a line from that rise. We have to build it up. We have to reinforce it." The people, desperate for direction, obeyed instantly. Men tore grain sacks from Ike's wagon. Charlie Cena, the blacksmith, organized a human chain, a line of men, women, and even teenagers, passing the heavy, mud-filled sacks from hand to hand to the brave few who worked at the edge of the groaning dam. It was brutal, exhausting work. The rain beat down on them, the wind tore at their clothes, and the mud sucked at their boots. But they worked with a desperate, unified energy. The same hands that had held a rope now passed a sandbag. Eliza saw the other battle that needed to be fought. A man slipped in the mud, and a heavy rock dislodged by the rising water crushed his foot. A young woman working at the water's edge was struck by a floating log. her forehead cut and bleeding. Panic and exhaustion were as dangerous as the water itself. Eliza grabbed Jess and Millie. "We are going to help," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the storm. She found a relatively sheltered spot beneath a rock outcropping and began to organize a makeshift aid station, using her midwife's knowledge. She directed Millie to tear strips from a clean blanket for bandages. She sent Jess to gather Spanish moss from the trees. Knowing its absorbent and antiseptic properties, she cleaned cuts, bandaged wounds, and spoke words of encouragement. Her calm presence a small but vital fire against the cold, wet misery. While the town fought the flood, Sheriff Alma Ruiz fought the rot at its source. She found Deputy Kincaid trying to organize Riker's few remaining loyal hands, urging them to guard the new channel, not the failing dam. Alma walked right up to him, her face set like stone. "It is over, Kincaid," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. "You cannot prove anything," he sneered, but his eyes darted nervously. "I can," Alma said, holding up the counterfeit seal she had retrieved from her office. "I know what to look for. The letter G on this one has a broken serif, a tiny flaw, but it is on every one of Riker's documents. You are a forger. Kincaid, you are under arrest." He reached for his gun, but two of the townsmen who had been in the sandbag line, their faces smeared with mud and fury, stepped forward and grabbed his arms. His power was gone. They disarmed him and tied his hands without waiting for the sheriff's command. Alma then saw Pastor Vale, huddled under a tree, trying to make himself invisible. She walked over to him, the false seal in one hand, a folded piece of paper in the other. It was the transcript from her mother's journal. "You have a history of this. Pastor," she said, her voice cold, "cheating honest people with dishonest paper. Your seal is flawed, and your character is worse." Vale simply crumpled, his piety dissolving in the rain, leaving only a small, frightened man in its place. The battle for the dam was being lost. The sandbags were not enough. The water was rising faster than they could work. Eliza knew the only person who could stop this was the man who had started it, leaving Jess in charge of the wounded. She began to walk toward the dam. She scrambled up the slippery, unstable bank of earth, the structure trembling beneath her feet. She stood on top of it, the wind whipping her hair across her face, and confronted Boone Riker, who stood on the opposite bank, a dark silhouette against the storm. "Look at them! Boone!" she shouted, her voice carrying across the roaring water. "These are the people of your town, the people you claim to be helping. You are going to drown them for a patch of grass. You are cashing in the future of this entire valley for your own private thirst." He stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. All his plans, all his manipulations, had come down to this, a lone woman on a failing dam, defying him. The law had turned against him. The people had abandoned him. All he had left was brute force. With a roar of fury, he pulled the pistol from his belt and aimed it at her. In that instant, a figure moved from the shadows near the trees. It was Grandmother Sumua. She held the two-patterned blanket, now soaked and heavy with rainwater. She did not shout or scream. She walked forward to the edge of the torrent, and with a powerful swing, she flung the heavy, wet blanket across the gap. It flew through the air like a net and slapped against Riker, enveloping his head and arms, blinding and unbalancing him. It was the only opening Sheriff Ruiz needed. The crack of her pistol was sharp and clear, distinct from the thunder. Riker cried out, not in death, but in pain and surprise. His gun flew from his hand, spinning through the air before landing in the muddy water. He clutched his shoulder, his face a mess of shock. Justice, not vengeance. But the dam was still breaking. A huge section sloughed off into the torrent, and the end was seconds away. Tahan saw it. He shouted, "Away from the middle! Break the sides! We have to let it go!" He was telling them to destroy what they had just tried to save, but they understood. A controlled break was their only hope. He led the men, grabbing axes and picks, and they began frantically tearing at the edges of the dam. widening the original creek bed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, guttural roar, the water found its old path. A torrent of brown, churning water surged through the widened channel. A controlled explosion of pressure. It poured back into its rightful course, its power immense, but now directed, saving the lowlands and the town. The groan of the failing dam subsided, replaced by the steady, powerful roar of a free-flowing creek. The rain began to soften. The thunder rolled away into the distance. The exhausted, mud-caked people stood in silence, watching the water. It was their water again. They were not a mob, and they were not subjects. They were a community, bound together by the mud, the rain, and the shared, desperate work of saving their home. The days that followed the storm were quiet, washed clean by the rain. The sky was a high, brilliant blue, and the air smelled of wet earth and sage. The fire at the granary had burned itself out, leaving a blackened skeleton against the horizon, a monument to one man's greed. But the creek, Box Willow Creek, ran steady and true in its old channel, a silver artery of life. A federal marshal arrived a week later, a tall, grim man whose authority was as plain and unadorned as his dusty coat. The hearing was not held in a formal courtroom, but in the main room of the supply post. The whole town crowded in to bear witness. It was not a trial of accusations, but a simple laying out of facts. Sheriff Alma Ruiz presented the old map, its edges curled, the stain of dried blood, a silent exclamation point on its surface. She presented the 2 county seals, the true and the false, and explained the tiny, damning flaw in the forger's G. Pastor Vale was the first to break, stripped of his pious authority. He was just a small man terrified of consequences. In a low, halting voice, he confessed everything. The scheme to create the false marriage contract, the forging of the water deeds, the lies he had told from the pulpit to stir the town to anger. He laid the blame squarely on Boone Riker, painting himself as a man led astray, a weak vessel. Then came the ledgers from Riker's ranch office, one by one. As the marshal read the names and the debts, the people in the crowd began to understand the true nature of the chains that had bound them. They were chains of credit, of obligation, of fear. Boone Riker had not been building a ranch. He had been building an empire of dependency. Riker himself stood defiant, his arm in a sling, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He denied nothing. He simply raged against the injustice of it all, the foolishness of a town that would choose a trickle of water in a creek over the prosperity he had promised. He saw them not as people, but as ungrateful assets who had failed to appreciate his vision. He was a king whose subjects had unaccountably rebelled. The marshal's judgment was swift and final. All deeds and claims made by Boone Riker pertaining to Box Willow Creek were declared null and void, based on clear evidence of fraud and forgery. The lands and assets of Riker were to be seized by the territory to settle his legitimate debts. For the crimes of conspiracy, forgery, and inciting a riot, he and Deputy Kincaid were sentenced to be transported to the federal prison at Leavenworth. There would be no hanging, no cycle of vengeance. There would only be the quiet, inexorable turning of the law. As the marshal led them away in shackles, a profound and weary silence settled over the room. The fight was over. In the days that followed, a new spirit took root in Adobe Wells. The shared danger and the collective effort at the dam had forged a new kind of community, led by Sheriff Ruiz, Tahan, and Eliza. The people gathered again, not as a mob, but as citizens, on a long plank table set up in the street. They drafted a new document. It was not a legal deed, but a simple agreement, written in plain language for all to understand. They called it the Box Willow Water Accord. It stated that the creek and its surrounding grasslands were a communal resource, to be shared by all. It gave first rights to the native people whose ancestors had drunk from it for centuries, and then to the families of the town itself. It established a council, with Alma Ruiz as its first overseer, to manage its use fairly, to ensure no single person could ever again threaten the lifeblood of them all. One by one, the people came forward. Old Ike made his shaky X. Charlie Cena signed his name, Mrs. Dawkins, her face full of a quiet pride, wrote hers with a firm hand. Even men who had ridden with Riker came forward, their faces humbled, and added their marks to the paper. They were not just signing a document, they were making a promise to each other. A few evenings later, as the sun began to dip toward the plains, a small group gathered on the banks of the creek. The water ran clear, whispering over the stones. Eliza stood beside Tahan, her hand in his. Across from them stood grandmother Sumua. Their witnesses were the family they had chosen, Alma Ruiz, standing straight and proud. Mrs. Dawkins, her eyes soft with tears, and Jess and Millie, who watched with a solemn, heartfelt joy. Sumua did not speak of God or law. She spoke of the earth, of the water, and of the sky. She spoke of two paths that run side by side, and of the strength that comes when they join as one. She took a single, long strip of soft, tanned leather, and with a gentle, practiced motion, she wrapped it around Eliza's wrist and then around Tahan's, binding their hands together. The leather was warm against their skin. It was not a chain, but a connection, a tangible symbol of the choice they had made. They stood there, bound together by the quiet water, under the vast and endless sky. Eliza looked at Tahan, at the calm strength in his face, and she saw her future. It was not a future free from hardship or struggle, but it would be a future she had chosen, a life built on a foundation of truth and courage. He looked at her, and in his eyes, the old ghosts of his past were finally still. He was no longer a man caught between worlds, but a man who had built a new world with the woman beside him. They had found their place. When Sumua gently unwrapped the leather cord, the ceremony was over. No grand pronouncements were made, none were needed. As the little group walked back toward the lights of the town, Tahan's hand found Eliza's again. This time, there was no fear, no uncertainty. There was only the quiet, powerful, and deeply reassuring knowledge that they were finally home. The summer that followed was born of a deep, collective sigh of relief. The good rains that had begun with the storm continued, a gentle, steady blessing that turned the plains from a parched brown to a soft, hazy green. The cattle grew fat and content, and the threat of thirst was a receding memory. In Adobe Wells, a new kind of life took hold, quieter, more deliberate, and infinitely stronger than before. The school that Eliza had come for finally opened. But it was not the stuffy, clapboard building she had once imagined. Its classroom was a sun-dappled clearing on the banks of Box Willow Creek, its roof the high, blue dome of the Texas sky, and its walls the rustling leaves of the ancient cottonwoods. Hanging from the thick branch of the largest tree, a place of honor, was the two-patterned blanket grandmother Sumua had given her. Its straight lines and interlocking diamonds were a constant, silent lesson in harmony and strength, a symbol of the new accord that bound the community together. Eliza taught the children their letters and numbers, using smooth, flat river stones as slates, but she also taught them from the pages of the Box Willow Water Accord, explaining the simple, powerful ideas of shared resources and common decency. It was a new kind of civics, born not from a distant government, but from their own shared struggle. Her co-teacher was Tahan. While Eliza taught the world of words and laws, he taught the world of the land. He showed the children how to read the clouds for signs of rain, how to understand the tracks of a deer, how to move through the world with quiet respect. He taught them to ride not with force, but with balance and understanding. His most important lesson was about the water itself. He would have them sit on the bank, close their eyes, and just listen to the voice of the creek, teaching them that it was not a thing to be taken, but a life to be honored. The seeds of the future, once threatened, were now sprouting in the rich soil of this new peace. Jess was rarely seen without a smudge of soot on his cheek. He had found his place at the forge with Charlie Cena. The quiet Navajo blacksmith had seen a fire in the boy, a desire to build rather than break, under his patient guidance. Jess was learning the magic of turning raw, stubborn iron into things of use and beauty. His hands, once small and frightened, were growing strong and sure, hammering out a future for himself with every ringing blow. Millie's path led her away from the fire and toward the cool, green places where the healing herbs grew. She became Grandmother Sumua's shadow, her small face a mask of intense concentration as she learned the ancient knowledge of the plants. She learned which roots soothed a fever, which leaves could close a wound, which flowers could calm a troubled spirit. Her touch, always gentle, became skilled and confident. She was learning not just to mend bodies, but to care for the well-being of her community, a healer in the making. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in soft shades of rose and violet, Eliza sat alone by the creek, her mother's journal open on her lap. The town was quiet, the only sounds the gentle murmur of the water and the distant, happy shouts of children, her children, playing in the fading light. She uncorked her inkwell, dipped her pen, and on a clean page at the back of the journal, she began to write a letter that would never be sent. My dearest mother, it has been so long. I wish I could tell you of this place, of the way the light settles on the plains at the end of the day. I came here looking for a position, for a way to honor the lessons of diligence and duty you taught me. I found something else entirely. I found that sometimes the most important documents are not deeds or contracts, but the simple promises people make to one another. I found that a community is not just a collection of buildings, but a circle of hands willing to do hard work together. You always told me that a good woman finds a safe harbor, a respectable home. For a time, I was so afraid I had failed you, that I had lost my way and brought shame to our name. But I have come to understand that a home is not always a thing with four walls and a roof. Sometimes, it is a piece of land you fight for. Sometimes, it is a person who sees you for who you are, not for who the world says you should be. I have chosen a home. Mother, it is a home not bound by forced papers, but by the heart and by justice. I think, I hope, you would be proud. She finished writing, the ink glistening in the last of the light. She did not feel the ache of loss as she usually did when thinking of her mother, but a quiet sense of peace, of a circle finally closed. A shadow fell over the page, and she looked up to see Tahan standing there. He did not speak, but sat beside her on the grassy bank. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a familiar, comforting weight. Together, they watched the first stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. The wind moved through the tall grass, a soft, sweeping sigh. From the town came the faint, musical clang of Charlie's hammer putting his tools to rest for the night. Downstream. A splash and a laugh told them that Jess and Millie had not yet given up their game. The creek whispered its endless story over the stones. It was a freedom so profound it did not need to shout. It was quiet, it was gentle, and it was as strong and enduring as the land itself. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to Wild West Tales. Like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.